Hello, friends. I'm Mike Nellis, and I'm the CEO of the Austin Community Foundation. I'm a little overgrown as well. At the foundation, we mobilize ideas and resources to strengthen Central Texas. And one of our key areas of interest, as Nora said, is in housing affordability. So we're so grateful for this day. I have the honor of introducing the panel conversation, addressing barriers to home ownership, expanding opportunities equitably. While home sales prices have dropped from their peak, home ownership remains out of reach for most low and moderate income Americans. Shortages in available housing, sales prices outpacing income growth, interest rates and other variables make it really hard for many to become homeowners. Homeownership remains one of the best ways for families to create intergenerational wealth. This panel will explore strategies to expand access to financing and other creative tools to create more ownership opportunities. So this session is moderated by Jeff Mosley. Jeff is the Director and National Program Lead for Capital Impact Partners' diverse developer programs, including the Equitable Development Initiative, or EDI. EDI is focused on growing the capacity of emerging real estate developers of color to undertake development projects in their communities, fostering opportunities for building residential and commercial space, and for intergenerational wealth accumulation. Jeff is bringing the Equitable Development Initiative to new markets across the country. Please welcome Jeff Mosley.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to invite my co-panelists to join me on stage. First, Devin Culbertson, Vice President for Innovation Financing at Grounded Solutions Network. And again, we're welcome to have Candace Valenzuela, the Regional Administrator for Region 6 for the Housing and Urban Development Agency.
Thank you so much.
So with that, maybe what I might say is the only tweak to that generous introduction is, and to this conversation, we should not only be talking about people becoming first-time home buyers, but making sure that people who have been long-time homeowners can stay in their homes and stay in their communities. It's just as important for that overall community stability, yes, to make sure that we address that. So definitely, thanks again. So let's just jump into it. And from time to time, I'm going to pretend that I'm a panelist, because I do love to hear myself talk. I'll start, Devin, with you. Can you share a little bit about your work on expanding, preserving home ownership opportunities for communities in the areas that you work?
Yeah. So Grounded Solutions is a national organization of about 250 members, with its origins really in the National Community Land Trust Network. So we have sort of a bias and a preference and a special love for community land trusts. But really our membership is focused on scaling housing with lasting affordability, with that preference around asset creation and around long-term stability and control. And so the work that we do on the Innovative Finance team is really adding to the body of work that Grounded Solutions has done for a long time, doing more around capital strategy and real estate strategy. So emphasizing the fact that these 250 odd groups are real estate companies. They're not-for-profit real estate companies, but they need sound strategy for their markets, and they need to be well capitalized. And in addition, we are, as a national group, attracting capital and raising that capital to do direct acquisitions. And that's really primarily focused on single-family portfolios from the SFR investors that are exiting certain markets or being squeezed out of certain markets, and then also direct acquisition and portfolio accumulation. And the goal of all that work is really to acquire those portfolios, hold those over time while they build equity, and transfer that equity into local housing organizations, shared equity organizations, and community land trusts by selling those at a discount once we have sufficient equity accumulated.
Great, thank you. And Candace, we were talking a little bit earlier, and you have quite a vast geography.
Yes, I do.
I don't envy you, but knowing many of the states and communities, you get to see a lot of opportunities and challenges as well. Can you sort of speak about what you see as some of the barriers, maybe either across Texas, that you see or in other areas that we should definitely take into consideration?
I think that this panel was introduced well because we are seeing a couple of really difficult things. Folks trying to age in place when they plan for retirement. A lot of them did not plan for a global pandemic, a significant spike in costs, and dealing with all that comes with that. So we're seeing a lot of folks that are fighting displacement. We're also seeing younger folks having a really hard time entering the housing market. And, I'm no stranger to the internet, and I see a lot of folks, why don't you just move to a place you can afford? I want to say something, and this is no shade on this lovely town of Fayetteville, Arkansas, but Fayetteville, Arkansas just declared a housing emergency this week, y'all. If Fayetteville, Arkansas, if Tulsa, Oklahoma, lovely places to live, lovely communities are struggling to house people, then I don't think there is really a place for us to go anymore. You cannot support a family anywhere in this country on a minimum wage salary. And so what does that look like? What does that mean? Well, it definitely means that home ownership is very, very difficult. It means renting is very, very difficult. And so trying to reduce those barriers, trying to prioritize ownership is something that's been significant for the Biden-Harris administration, is significant and I'm going to still talk about her. So our secretary just stepped down a couple of weeks ago, so I still talk about the impact of her work, but it's important to former Secretary Fudge and acting Secretary Adrian Todman that we are speaking directly to those community issues and doing what we can as a federal agency and not lawmakers ourselves to make things work for the American people that we encounter every day.
Excellent. Just by way of sort of why I'm sitting here on some level is with Capital Impact Partners, I don't know who's familiar with the term CDFI. I get asked about it a lot, Community Development Financial Institution. Part of our focus is to make sure that we're bringing capital into communities. We've talked a lot about the struggles and needs for people to secure an affordable place to live, whether it's to rent or to home. Just to say, we're not going to build ourselves out of this crisis that we're in, but we do need to build. And we as an organization, Grounded Solution, and others like us are those kind of partners to do that. I'm just going to take a second. I have my colleagues over there at the table who are actually making that happen. They don't let me touch the money anymore. So our wonderful community lending team, including our chief lending officer, is here. So I think it helps show our commitment to this work and to be a good partner in place. All that to say is that being able to not only deliver capital but understand the specific needs of different places, because as we'll get into this conversation, there's no one solution. And being able to have partners, for-profit, non-profit institutions that can bring the tailored capital to help make sure that we can that there's long-term affordable housing, whatever your income level is, so that there is healthy communities, that everyone has a place, is what we do. And I've been in this space for over 30 years, so it definitely works, and happy to be here. Devin, one of the things that we've talked about in other communities as a strategy are community land trusts and shared equity home ownership models. Can you talk a little bit about how they work and why they're important to consider?
Yeah, I will spare you the 6-hour version. The training is online at our website. But at the core concept, whether you're talking about a community land trust, whether you're talking about a shared equity vehicle, there's a lot of different legal mechanisms, a lot of different board structures. But fundamentally, what they all have in common is that this idea that there is a trust that holds the land over time, and that the homeowner is able to buy the house or the multifamily unit that sits on that land. And what you get with that is that homeowner is buying that home at a discount. And part of the agreement for buying that home at a discount is that they will also sell subject to a resale formula. So there's some price restriction on the sale price that makes it affordable to the next buyer. So to be clear, that doesn't take away any of the amortization as they're paying off their mortgage. All of that is theirs to keep. It's just a restriction on the growth of the value of that property. And that is kind of this core tenet that does a couple things. One is it creates kind of a middle ground between preserving affordability and wealth creation. It's trying to do some of both, but holding those two in balance, recognizing that both are critical. It also anchors those two things in place. So it's not just a financial mechanism. It's not a down payment assistance program, something like that, where there's no address. It's in that community. So when you invest in a place early, generations of families have an opportunity to build wealth and have an affordable home in that place. And so as we see displacement become more of an issue in different places, the attractiveness of a vehicle that doesn't just create affordability anywhere or create wealth anywhere, but also allows people to stay in that place is becoming more and more important. So we can unpack that more as we go.
Great. And we heard a little bit earlier about one such example in Chicago. So it's very exciting to see, and I think we'll definitely come back to that. Candace, can you talk a little bit about the Federal Housing Administration, their efforts to make systemic changes to the FHA loans to make it easier for people to enter ownership market?
Sure thing. Right out the gate, we were looking at ways to make it easier for folks to access these loans. We, a couple of years ago, lowered the cost of mortgage insurance, saving families something like, if they're at the average house price of $400,000, $1,400 a year, which is significant if you're adding things up as a family. $600 million of savings to the entire country. We're also doing things I feel like we should have done long ago. For instance, counting positive rental history when considering your FHA loan. If you are going to pay reliably on your place of living, you're probably going to continue to do so, right? Changing the way in which student loans are weighted against you when getting an FHA loan, again, significantly reducing the impact of that. And also, and this was a big thing we were discussing here in Austin, if you were to buy a home with an ADU and you have the intention of renting out your casita, your mother-in-law bungalow, whatever you want to call it, then that income that you could be making will count for you as income when getting that FHA loan. We're also expanding opportunities to purchase manufactured homes. We're updating some of the safety guidelines so that folks are not living in trailers that are carcinogenic. I didn't actually know that trailers could be carcinogenic, and as it's really interesting, my life experience lends itself really well to this. I've been homeless, I've lived in a shelter, I've also lived in a trailer, and had no idea that in addition to all the other the other things that could be working against you when you are in the kind of poverty that sometimes brings you to those places, if this isn't your choice, that having living conditions that could give you cancer was one of them. And so I'm really excited that HUD is both opening the door to different types of housing and making it easier to get loans for that housing, but also ensuring that the quality of life isn't compromised in any way for folks.
Excellent. One of the things that's in the work that we all do in order to make sure that not only are people able to become first-time home buyers to remain as homeowners is that local fabric. Community-based organizations, some of whom are represented here on the ground, sort of the unsung heroes in my eyes. Can you talk a little bit, each of you, about the type of partners that you typically see in this work and what's critical to help making sure that we can provide that kind of security in the communities? So,
sure. So for the work that Grounded Solutions does, we are not a long-term owner in any community in the country. We're looking to be sort of a steward to the stewards, and ultimately be helping those community-based groups kind of grow their portfolio, grow their impact, become more sustainable over time. I think that it's that one of the things we do when we're starting to look at doing acquisitions in a place is to really understand sort of what is the model that folks want to have in their community in terms of that shared equity or CLT model. Kind of what are the nuances of that? Where do they want to grow? Are they really trying to sort of keep folks in a certain place and have a more of an anti-displacement strategy? Are they following folks that are already being displaced into suburban and exurban counties, and kind of understand that, and then craft a structure that really helps them scale with what folks are trying to do there? Because ultimately, if we fall into the trap of being long-term owners from 1,000 miles away, we're not much better than the folks we're trying to replace.
Right.
HUD in a number of ways has made money available for folks that are trying to stay in place. Actually, a couple of years ago, within the administration, we issued money to help older folks renovate their homes so that they can age in place. We also have the Office of Lead and Healthy Homes. And when we go in there and you find lead, sometimes it's not just about the lead remediation. It's also about the overall conditions for those homes. I've seen folks be able to use that for wheelchair ramps, for overall safety concerns so that folks can continue to live in their homes. We're also talking with folks, again, about zoning, how they are planning for their senior communities, how they're planning for their newer communities when they're thinking about putting in more housing, how we can incentivize more affordable housing. And if we can, I know that it seems kind of counterintuitive to talk about newer housing, but when we have some sort of control over the cost it takes to live someplace, we also prevent some displacement of folks that are already living in those neighborhoods. So it's encouraging folks, advising folks on being more intentional about their future planning so that folks that are in their neighborhoods can continue to preserve the value and the quality of that neighborhood. We're also allowing folks to use, I'm sure you all know that CDBG funds are fairly flexible. And when we're able to use that, again, to put in grocery stores, to help out small businesses, to help out community job creators, then we're able to keep folks from having to move out. A lot of folks really care about seeing their kids grow up and then seeing their grandkids grow up. And so making sure that opportunity doesn't bring them all to one centralized location, but keeps them in their neighborhoods is something that we value and push for.
Excellent. One of the things that I've been mindful of, and particularly in the conversation throughout this day, are protections. Protections for the families, the residents, to be able to get advocacy, get support. So I do want to call out the role for fair housing in this space, that it is important that all families understand that there is that opportunity for everyone to be able to, in many communities around the country, there are fair housing organizations as well as housing counseling. Housing counseling, to me, is one of the linchpins of being able for people to live affordably and securely. I don't know who the housing counseling entity is in the Austin area, but when I think about community and that fabric, having housing counseling, fair housing advocates is definitely part of maybe the non-capital side of this equation, but it's for those families that are struggling. And to the point of the earlier panel on eviction, we want to make sure that those families at risk of foreclosure are not actually having to experience that. So thank you, and I'll thank my guests. I sort of surprised them with that one. Candace, just another question for you. Can you talk a little bit about the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, what it is, and how HUD is using this resource to expand homeownership?
Sure. So the family is Is my mic out? Oh, nope, there we go. So the Family Self-Sufficiency Program is a combination of case management and housing counseling. It helps folks that are of limited means to try to find their way to their educational goals, their financial goals. At times there's also investment into an escrow account so that they are able to then move to purchasing their own home. So it's a combination of again, that education and that enrichment that doesn't just hand folks a place to live, but hands them the ability to stay in that place, hands them the ability to eventually pass that place on to their children, but also pass on the knowledge of homeownership. I know that it's a big jump for some folks when they're going from living in an apartment or renting their entire lives, when maintenance was taken care of one entity, or when you don't have to actually consider the property values or what is going to be happening from time to time. And so we're able to spend time and funding to bridge that gap for families who haven't had those opportunities.
Great. So I wanted to come back to a topic, Devin, we started to talk about different models for delivering, maintaining homeownership. We talked about shared equity. What other models have you seen that are useful around in other communities that you've been working in?
Well, I think that when it comes to this space, there's actually a lot of foundation-funded kind of studies and meta-studies of different models and permutations, and often what those are looking at is sort of what is the legal structure, what are the kind of the hard mechanisms, if you will, maybe to extent what is the financial mechanisms, but I think what's really interesting when you talk about the models is what is kind of the softer side, like what is the organizing model, what is the sort of reason for being and to bring folks together around some of this work, and often how are the leaders supported that are bringing these things forward? Because ultimately, the attorneys will figure out how to structure the documents. You can find some support on the kind of getting the numbers to work and working the Excel spreadsheet. But if you don't have the folks that are figuring out what works for folks in community, that's really challenging. And particularly to this question, which I think we might talk about more later, is where you have this push and pull between what it means to have shared equity or shared appreciation or some balance that's something other than pure fee simple home ownership, I'm going to buy a home and get rich sort of vision, juxtaposing that to other folks who have a really different vision of what it might mean to own, what decommodification might mean in that community. So I think that there's just a lot to pull together to move something forward, and it's often way less about what's in the documents and what's in the spreadsheet than like how you actually pull people together to get comfortable with this.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you said that, because I'm very familiar with the CLT model and shared equity, and I've heard from practitioners that some families that are planning to grow, move into another community or circumstance are expecting that sort of appreciation, and they come back and well, wait a second, where's all my money? It's
right.
Sort of like you guys are no better than anybody else. So the training or the communication that has to go into any type of program, frankly, what are the expectations? Because I think in this space, we're sort of talking largely around affordable housing development and programs that, because I'm low or mod income, I have to participate in this program, and therefore my appreciation is going to be limited. Again, it's sort of taking this negative position on a family, but being able to well communicate and educate on the broader value for the community is what needs to happen, and sometimes gets missed in how we communicate to our families about what they're getting into. Another model that I'm familiar with that I've seen in urban and rural communities, mutual self-help programs where families, and it's not a new program, it's been around for many decades, that families work together in a community to actually help build each other's homes.
Yes.
Some of you may be familiar with that as a way to get into home ownership, but not only building their own opportunity, but to build their community and their neighbors. So there's wonderful track records. HUD has invested in that as well as USDA in terms of not just a financing model, but also a way to promote home ownership. One of the things, though, that, and I want to get to this question in a second, but sort of where I'm going with this is that we're building partnerships and ecosystems. And one of the things that we've done with Capital Impact Partners here in Austin, several of you may be familiar that we've been part of an ecosystem here for a long time, but largely in the last year. We've worked in partnership with Housing Works Austin and the City of Austin, the Austin Housing Finance Corporation to bring our small developer training based on our EDI program. It's mindful that we're not only focused on people to live affordably, but we also want to change the narrative and build the opportunity for people to actually enact on developing and restoring their communities. So we've worked over the past year with 18 developers, and I think some of them are actually here in the audience. So if any of them are here, I invite you to stand up. So we've recognized that, particularly in the Austin context, that there are very few small-scale Austin developers, who are helping to make change in their communities, and we wanted to change that narrative. But we also wanted to make sure, as they're building as developers, entrepreneurs, frankly, that they're supported by a local network. So one of the things that we've been able to do is to introduce them to people in the ecosystem who they will be working with to develop their projects. And I do understand that some of the advisors and presenters are also here, and if you're in the audience, can you stand up as well? Maybe they left earlier in the day. But just to underscore that as we're sort of building this fabric, building this ecosystem, it takes many partners, public, nonprofit, philanthropic. So not only in this case, have we gotten support from the City of Austin to do this and the fantastic partnership from Housing Works Austin, but we also received generous funding from the Austin Community Foundation, the RISA Foundation, and PNC Bank as well. So I really just want to take this opportunity to thank them for that. So I want to come back to some of the questions if we can, but for Candace, we heard earlier in the day from, maybe I'll call him Professor Perry, but Egbert Perry, because I know him, is on the appraisal gap issue.
Yes.
And can you talk a little bit about what is the Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity Task Force and why its work is necessary to ensure that communities of color are better served?
And it's really interesting to talk about that on the tail of CLTs. So this task force was founded in response to some really serious issues of property appraisal equity. So just to give you a little bit of background, there are homes in this country that are in black neighborhoods, that are in brown neighborhoods, and on average, once you put in similar incomes, similar amenities, black homes are put at $48,000 less in valuation than white homes. This has come up to an amount of lost equity of over $160 billion. And again, that's not past, this is not over a period of time, this is right now. And part of this goes back to whether we have, and I'll just go with cultural competence, whether or not we have folks that are looking at they're evaluating the neighborhood, the home on its merits, as opposed to looking at the color of the skin of the person who happens to be inhabiting that home. We've had a couple of really significant cases. What's going on? My mic, I apologize if I'm not speaking appropriately into it. Let me sit a little taller. All right. This is a good way to police my posture. Some families have gone through the process of having their homes appraised. Maybe they're doing it to sell. Some folks are trying to refinance because they want to renovate. Maybe they want to start a small business or support their children in buying a home. And they'll get an appraisal. And it'll be a little bit lower than they expected. And so they'll go through this process called whitewashing. They will, for me, I would be taking down, my picture of James Baldwin. I would be hiding my Essence and my Latina magazines. I would take down pictures of my family, and I would find one of my white friends and get their cute grandmother and get her picture and put all of those things up. And it's incredible that there have been significant differences in the amount of appraisal value. In fact, one family, they're actually the Austin family, but they're in Marin County, California, so they're not from here. They actually saw a difference of $500,000 in the value of their home. They actually went before Congress to talk about it. And it's really hurtful for folks. A lot of us as homeowners, especially if we've gotten to the point that we've gotten a home. Home ownership was not something that was inevitable for me. You believe in, on some level, the value of the American dream, that merit, that the fact that you worked hard for your money in your household means something. It was a shock for a lot of these families who were like, let me just see what happens, to see that the worst, or the thing that brought down the value to their home in the eyes of these property appraisers was them. This actually even happened to Secretary Fudge. She talks about the fact that she had a neighbor whose home had a smaller lot. In her opinion, was not as nice looking. Did not have a pool. I think was appraised at $50,000 over her home, and she was the secretary of HUD. So if she is in a position where she can't get a fair appraisal, it's very, very difficult for the rest of us. And frankly, the appraisal industry is not necessarily reflective of the United States. And by not reflective, I mean about 97% of appraisers are white, 80% of appraisers are male. I have to tell you that ranchers and sommeliers are more diverse than our appraisal workforce. Sommeliers, y'all. So the secretary convened with Ambassador Rice and 11 other federal agencies to go through and do some study on this and working with our appraisal organizations throughout the country, both state and national, to work on just equity. How are we expanding access to the appraisal industry for folks? What are some necessary conditions to get in and do the actual work? And what were things designed to just keep people, and I'm going to be honest, people of color out of this industry and fairly evaluating those neighborhoods? The secretary and the PAVE task force, so the Property Appraisal Valuation Equity Task Force, is also working with NAREB to develop NAREB. I'm sorry.
Acronym.
I know. Did I say it wrong?
No. I was wondering if you could say it out.
Oh, sorry. So it's a national realtor organization that is primarily African American. I think it's a lot easier than to spell out the acronym. So they're working with NAREB to come up with a curriculum with folks so that they can go through, and there are some states that are taking this on and making this a requirement for their appraisers. So we're doing a lot of work in ensuring that people have access to that equity if they are buying into a more normal situation, so that they can reinvest that money either in themselves, in aging in place, putting it into their small business, as I mentioned earlier, or putting it into their children, just like anyone else thinking about their home ownership. Because the fact of the matter is, for Black families, for Latino families, we hold our wealth in our homes. Most of us do not have stock portfolios. Most of us do not have 401ks. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be investing in those, and that is something that we're definitely moving in the direction of doing. But the reality is, our homes, for the vast majority of us who have them, are our wealth. And so those assets need to be treated equitably, and we're working hard on making sure that that does happen.
Excellent. Thank you. Devin, maybe not everyone knows that you also sort of have a developer hat. I'm outing you.
I can dust it off.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to dust it off here.
Okay.
So with this part of a systemic issue, communities, by and large, are undervalued. As you've looked at communities to undertake your work, what has been the implications of properties, communities that are undervalued when you're trying to envision and put together a deal for whether it's single family or a large rental?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges is having that conversation about the appreciation gap, which is distinct from the appraisal gap, right? And that there are that all communities are not appreciating in value equally or at all. And there's kind of a national narrative about what is happening, particularly around homeownership, that all, rising tide lifts all boats, all of that stuff, that if you own a home, you own an appreciating asset categorically, which isn't always true. And so as we go and do this process I described of understanding where folks are in their communities, what they want to do, what their goals are, sometimes we have to have this conversation of saying, this actually isn't a great fit, right? If what you're looking for is stability, maybe it is. If what you're looking for is the ability to amortize some debt, be in your home, pass that home on, not avoid displacement, there are things that make sense here. But if we're talking about buying assets that we would assume would appreciate, either for our interim hold or for folks to be able to buy those and hold those long term, sometimes we start to look at communities and say that it's just not here. The appreciation, not to say that it never will be, but we need to sort of be doing this for the right reasons and acquiring the land and holding and having that long-term ownership for the right reasons. And when I say the right reasons, I mean the reasons that resonate with the folks that are trying to do the work. And so I think it's often sort of less of a, this doesn't pencil or this does pencil, but to say, like, if we're doing this, this is what we can likely see and this is what we might hope to see. And so having that conversation and teasing that apart is what's really challenging. When we're trying to apply our capital to it, we do have this sort of problem of it either pencils or it doesn't, because we have, we have requirements that we have to meet. And so sometimes we do have to say, like, this community doesn't work for what we're trying to do. How can we help you do what you're looking for? And that certainly starts to come into play when we're layering on the other things like climate risk, where we're saying, if we're talking about a multi-generational hold and we don't have a real strategy for being thoughtful about either protecting these buildings or being selective about acquisition, it's hard to move into a place. So there's really difficult conversations that have to be had, and sometimes those are things that folks understand at some level, but don't really want to acknowledge and have openly. And sometimes they're things that are kind of buried in the invisible data that you don't necessarily know just living your life in a place.
No, I appreciate that. In part, I ask because if or when we have a future equitable development initiative, I'm going to peg you. Being able to demystify some of this or have some of this context for developers as they're looking at their communities. What is that appreciation? What is that valuation? And what does it mean in terms of development strategies? Is a very critical piece to understand long-term for a community. What is that right mix? And especially in light of earlier conversations of local transit strategies or other assets that are coming into play, and how do you take that into account? Before we start to jump into questions from the app that I'm looking through, I wanted to see if there were other, and this is for you, Candace, if there were other priorities from the administration or from where you're sitting as an administrator that we should take into account relative to homeownership?
Oh, sure. So just to add on to that housing counseling piece, we've also made money available through down payment assistance. So some localities are taking that on. If you go through a HUD certified housing counselor, in some jurisdictions, you can be eligible for tens of thousands of dollars in down payment assistance. And of course, this stands to primarily help communities of color. And so that's one thing we're really, really proud of. We talked about the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, and for us, the Self-Help Opportunity Program, so the SHOP program, in which we have folks that are building their homes with their neighborhoods, with their neighborhood in rural areas. So it's been really exciting to see that in rural Arkansas, in Louisiana. We're also doing these HUD house parties. So we are going into, and I can't, if any of you have the number for Kid and Play, I've been trying to get a hold of them. None of them are answering my calls. But what we're doing what we can. We are going into areas and talking to young people about how to access FHA loans, what their first step should be, after they're done with their education. Should I go after that car, or should I go after that home first? How can I best leverage the nothing that I have but time, so that I'm able to find my way to home ownership? And I mean, we're not, I love being in hotel ballrooms, but for our house parties, we're trying to go to community blocks. In Texas, I've been to 2 different LGBTQ wedding expos, the Salsa Festival in Houston. We actually had a house party that was literally straight out of Compton. And I'm going to die mad because I couldn't go. We even had a house party at the 50th anniversary of house music in Chicago. Yeah, so we're trying to actually talk to folks about homeownership when they're in a relatively good mood, but folks that aren't necessarily clamoring for housing policy conferences, and y'all are wonderful and lovely people, but y'all know how to find a home, right? And we have to figure out ways to stop talking to each other or stop talking to folks that know about this and start getting into places where we're going to find folks that need to build that intergenerational wealth.
Excellent. I'm looking at some of the questions, and I'm going to. One of them has to deal with sort of what we were talking about in terms of different models. I'm going to throw this to Devin at first, and Ken, if you want to weigh in, feel free. The shared equity models such as housing co-ops offer unique benefits for affordable homeownership, but they may still be unfamiliar to many. What strategies are most effective in educating communities about these options, and how can we change the common perception of homeownership to be more inclusive?
It's a good question. I think there's sort of 2 sides to it. One is, I think that the earlier CLT models, the resale models, the technical stuff got really Byzantine and really hard to navigate. And even when folks were coming and trying to learn about those things, what they remembered from that orientation to when they went to sell their home 7 years later, and how they ran the math of what they thought it led to a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of frustration, and it was unnecessary. And so a lot of groups are sort of shifting, be it a CLT or other models, to things that are much simpler. So a fixed percentage, like 2% a year from what you paid. You do have the calculator on your phone in 10 minutes. 10 seconds, right? And you really know. So like building more clarity and the intention to be better understood into the models, I think is the one side. And the other is just making sure early and often that folks understand sort of what it is that you're offering, what it means, what it doesn't. I think putting it in context of other wealth creation strategies, when it makes sense, when it doesn't. Is it this is the bond in your portfolio, not the big growth stock, right? Like kind of getting a sense of where that fits and who it's right for, and not trying to make shared equity the solution for everybody.
Right.
Kind of finding that right fit, and then circling back often. And one of the things that one of the benefits of these organizations is that they're also, in effect, kind of community-based organizations as well, and doing other sorts of supports and supporting supporting owners in other ways. And part of that is helping them continue to understand, okay, this is what's going on with your home, this is where your valuation is. If you do want to get a home equity line, here are your options. So I think it's just really making sure that it's not kind of a one and done engagement, that it's an ongoing conversation.
And this is for either of you. One of the other strategies someone's asking about is rent-to-own lease purchase strategies. And Candace, I don't know if you have an opinion on that as a strategy, but what have you all seen?
A lot of fraud. No, I'm so sorry. Yeah, a lot of the folks that are explicitly rent to own is something that we warn about because a lot of those time, I've seen so many terrible things, and again, primarily in poor communities of color, where folks have been making payments on homes for years with the idea that they owned it, and even after paying it off, it is still not their property. We have, the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, the SHOP program, but we also have in certain jurisdictions, folks having the ability to use their housing voucher to help them to purchase a home as well. So there are some programs that are out there to help folks to purchase homes, but the vast majority of those rent-to-own ads, commercials, whatever you happen to see, specifically for housing, typically have some hidden language there that typically hurts poor communities.
And I just add that a lot of the research that we did developing the model that we're using now to acquire single-family homes looked at some of these, because we initially thought maybe there is sort of a kindler, gentler, better rent-to-own model, and we talked to a lot of folks and found that even folks that are really well-meaning and not predatory really struggle to make it work. And by that I mean maybe 20% conversion rate. And a lot of that, and for a host of reasons, but a lot of that is that folks' needs and circumstances and abilities financially change over the course of multiple years. And so when you're talking about something that's 5, 7, 8, 10 years in terms of that transition, which some of them were, the likelihood that your trajectory was going to be exactly as anticipated is just very low. And that, and even for some folks who had that, they were saying, well, yeah, now I can buy a home, but I don't want this home. Right. And so that kind of perfect matching, I think we have this mental model that those programs can be, if well-intentioned, they can kind of have this perfect conversion that you can make the spreadsheet work, but it rarely fits. And so we're looking for ways to have that be a little bit more nimble. How are you having renters better supported? How are you having them build wealth? How are you having them get ready for home ownership in the ways that make sense to them, and then have a well-supported, well-resourced transition moment that might be to buy that home or might be to buy a different home, but that's not quite in lockstep in this way just because it doesn't work as intended.
Okay. Thank you for that. This might be a quick yes or no question for you. Do modular homes or shipping container homes qualify for FHA?
Modular, maybe. Shipping containers, no. I don't think we're there at this point. We have specific standards that FHA loans need to adhere to, and I don't believe that shipping containers actually meet those standards.
And then we have another question. This gets back to the issue of people being able to stay in their homes. What are the resources available? for people to stay in their house, to do repairs, so they can live affordably and securely?
So what I would say is that to talk to your city or your county. Again, as I mentioned, we make funds available for folks aging in place, for veterans aging in place, for lead and healthy hazards, but it depends on whether or not your jurisdiction has in fact applied for those funds. I hate to take it one step away from us, but HUD is primarily a funding agency, and how we do our work largely depends on the work of the community. So talk to your city, talk to your county about some of those programs designed to help with home repair.
Great. And I'll take this next question, and again, Devin, as you're sort of the developer also at the table, maybe you might have an opinion on this, but why is it important to talk about develop the capacity of developers of color?
I think that there's a myriad of reasons. I think the most often cited is that folks from a community understand the needs of that community and are sort of best connected with being able to deliver not just the product in broad strokes, but in some nuance in terms of what folks need. We've been working with a group in South Seattle, African Housing and Community Development, and they're working on 6-bedroom townhomes because they're saying nobody builds this, and we have typically 6 to 8 kids. And this is what our families need, and so they're trying to deliver that. I also think that it's a really important industry, a really lucrative industry, and it's an industry that's so driven by networks and access. And so if you aren't sort of build networks and access among folks of color, folks are being shut out from, maybe they want to build townhomes for their community, maybe they want to build affordable housing, maybe they want to build Hyatts. Maybe they want to, so there's a whole trajectory of career options that need to be opened up to a group of folks, and if you're not born into it, you have no place at that table. And so it's a little crack in the door, but it's an important start.
Right.
And actually, if you don't mind, I'd like to
Please
weigh in
do.
as well. I mean, as we're seeing a lot of just the cost of either living or the cost of owning a business increasing in certain jurisdictions, I feel like so many areas are starting to lose their cultural flavor, for lack of a better term, right? Some of our favorite things typically tend to work on the margins. I'm thinking about art or dance, or the dance studio I would take my kids to, or when I'm thinking about some of those hole-in-the-wall restaurants, those hole-in-the-wall restaurants continue to look like holes in the wall because they're not bringing a huge profit in. And when we're talking about development or bringing or redeveloping areas, because of the fact that there is such limited access to those circles also have a very specific, very insular culture that may not necessarily value other aspects of local culture the way that the community would. And I'm not saying that that's impossible. I've seen some incredible developers who come from a very specific type of life do the research and the work to understand others. But it's a lot faster if you actually come from those communities to help preserve what makes those communities wonderful for those people who are living there. What makes those communities want folks to want to reinvest in them and love on them. It's so important to have developers and appraisers look like the communities that they're serving.
Can I riff on that a little bit?
Please.
Sure.
I think it's a really great point, and I think it also raises for me that we need to approach some of this notion of with some humility, that we have not figured out the perfect real estate system to serve all people, that we're just explaining to the poor people who don't understand.
Yeah.
I think that we've seen a lot of cultural competency, that there's this two-way learning, that when you sort of understand what works for folks in their community, maybe you're bringing something back, maybe you're bringing something to an adjacent community. We were working in Denver in 2 adjacent neighborhoods, both with multi-generational business owners, some that were struggling to be displaced, and another that all owned their own buildings. And as you start to understand, it's because they have lending circles, and because they worked with the money in their community in a different way that served them extraordinarily well, and in fact better than what we showed up with, right, for their community. So I think just making sure that it's not that we don't approach it in this kind of really hierarchical, paternalistic sort of way.
Right.
That we make sure that we're all kind of growing the knowledge together.
And sometimes when you come from different communities, it's not just about asking questions. I mean, that's a huge part of it. But if you don't speak that cultural language, you might not necessarily know which questions to ask.
Amen. One of the things, just to add on to this, is the reason why we do this work is we're also building communities. We're also building communities of developers. So one of the things that we did with the Austin Small Developer Training inherently is that we're building a community so that emerging developers, just by the very nature, particularly those of color, the conversation with Dr. Perry, there's not a lot of wealth. There's not a lot of family wealth. There's not a lot of community wealth. And, and I'll say as a lender, it's like you're coming to the table with not a lot, who's there with you? And being able to create opportunities for joint ventures, for partnerships, to bring others into that development space, that there's trust and reliability, is not only beneficial for that deal, but it's going to be beneficial for a whole pipeline of projects that's going to have an impact on that community.
Yeah.
So, we're really looking at a long-term gain here. So of all the communities across, in this case, Austin, that we are essentially planting seeds. And it's, the seeds were already there. I mean, we're pouring water, to help germinate this. But the other thing that we're doing, and I think to your point, is for the financing institutions to really have an opportunity to understand, learning what are those particular neighborhood, community, but developer needs, because sometimes it's not just the deal, it's the growth of the enterprise. We want to make sure that not only are we growing units that are affordable, but we want to see the developers growing long-term, because they're going to hire architects, engineers, accountants. We're creating an ecosystem in the community, in the broader jurisdiction, that's going to, that may not be part of the larger $500 million deals, but that we do have it for these smaller deals, and we're creating this, this entryway for them. You see, when I get talking, I don't look at questions. And I see we're running short of time, but there was another question in here that I'll ask Devin. If developers get multiple sources of income capital stacking to make development projects work feasible, how can we begin to offer capital stacking for low mod income residents for down payment assistance?
It's a great question. I think it depends a lot on your lender and what the mortgage company will allow. I think there is some interesting innovation, not necessarily in capital stacking in the down payment necessarily, but in the role of reserves and the sort of risk perception, kind of mining and starting unpacking when folks are actually defaulting and for what reasons. And so when can that be reserved in different ways so that kind of opens up more access to lending. But I think the actual notion of like truly capital stacking in the way you would in a conventional real estate deal is going to depend so much on what the mortgage lender will allow, because I think that's pretty regulated.
Great. So we're about at time. Are there any final thoughts, observations that either of you'd like to share? No requirement.
I'd say the only other thing from my perspective is really it's exciting to think big and it's harder to think long. Mm-hmm. And there's often these ideas about let's do a strike fund, or let's do this kind of fund, or let's do something that's kind of big and ephemeral. And I think really investing in the in the actors and the organizations and the infrastructure to buy and hold and sustain your community in different ways is often so much more powerful than a shorter term financing tool. And it's just, it takes a lot more work. It takes a lot more, tilling of the soil and, and all the growth metaphors. But we are in a long game, whether your game is closing the racial wealth gap, whether you're thinking about the trajectory of your city or even your neighborhood. There's folks that have been sitting on properties in some of these neighborhoods for 30, 40 years.
Yes.
Right? Like, this is a long, long game.
Yeah.
And so having that perspective, I think, is part of what's going to make us successful in winning it.
Excellent.
I think a lot of, and kind of going off of that, a lot of folks tend to perceive a lot of these barriers to be completely intractable, or within the purview of federal law and fair housing, and there is actually a lot that fair housing can do. So if you have questions, please reach out to HUD about discrimination. But in terms of the actual barriers, so much of that is done at the local level. So much is done by my small community banks to make sure that capital is available. Yes, let's applaud our community banks. Because those community banks are invested in seeing the success of your family, your grandma, your children, because they see them every day in a way that have a lot of larger banks don't have that opportunity. So it's if you're asking about how you can have an impact on some of these barriers, ask questions. Show up to some of your. I'm not going to ask you to talk to any legislators. Just in case somebody's listening, that'll violate the Hatch Act. I'm not telling you have to talk to anybody, but you should at least be curious about how your city is planning and zoning for housing, and how development comes in, if they're accounting for affordable housing, if they're protecting your favorite small business. What's actually happening is happening every single day in your local offices. So just make sure you stay curious and show up.
Well said. Well, we've gotten assigned to wrap up, so I don't want to find out what happens if we don't. But please, let's give a round of applause again for our presenters.